Next, we'll have Dr. Barry McCleary, who many of you already know from Megazyme, who's going to talk about his latest work in methods development. Barry?
Need the glasses. Thanks, John, and thanks, David, as well. You covered a fair bit of the stuff that I might have had to cover. Now, I assume there's one of these buttons moves it forward, so just the big ring. Okay. So this is about development and validation of a rapid codex-compliant method for the measurement of total dietary fibre. In the FDA's terms, that's non-digestible carbohydrates. I'm not going to go into the business of measuring and subtracting because we're all going to have sufficient headaches with that over the next couple of years. I'm just talking about the measurement, the total, and then we'll go on from there. What we see in this particular diagram, in the blue circle in the centre, is what's actually measured with the Prosky method. So most of the insoluble and higher molecular weight polysaccharides, soluble ones, are measured. We measure part of the resistant starch, part of some of the other things. Around about 2000 and perhaps 2 or 3 people decided they wanted to measure these other things like inulin and resistant starch, so methods were developed. But the trouble is you can see the overlap. If you measure resistant starch with the resistant starch method and total dietary fibre and add the two together, you get double counting of that overlap. So that's where the particular problem came in, and that's where we got interested in trying to do something about measuring everything, which is that box around the outside. So after quite a few, I suppose a few years of work, we came up with the method which we call the integrated procedure, which went through into laboratory studies and became 2009.01 and 2011.25. And the incubations on the left-hand side were trying to match physiology and trying to link in with resistant starch methods that have been published in the 90s and one we published in early 2000, basically using pancreatic alpha amylase, the PAA, and amyloglucosidase, 37 degrees pH 6. 16 hours is worth noticing. The reason we did that is because most of the resistant starch methods used 16 hours. Now, food doesn't sit in our small intestine for 16 hours. So one of the major complaints we had about this method when we went to fibre is that that time is not physiologically relevant. So anyway, you hydrolyze the protein, you precipitate with alcohol, you get the residues, you measure that weight, you get the filtrate, which is concentrated and measured by high-performance liquid chromatography, and that gives you the measure of the non-digestible oligosaccharides. Now, we call that SDFS, in other words, the soluble dietary fibre that's soluble in the 78% alcohol, and the other one that's precipitated is SDFP, because it's a polysaccharide that precipitates with alcohol. But it became 2009.01, and of course, whenever you put out a method you think is perfect, there's a lot of people come out and say, well, it doesn't quite measure my product. The biggest single complaint was the business about 16-hour incubation, and we couldn't argue about that. So what we did is we looked through literature, and the average time I could see in literature from studies other people did was between 3 and 5 hours. So we settled on 4 hours based on what we got from literature as the time that we needed to go to. And we changed that time to get the samples. The analysis was based on trying to get resistant starch values for a set of samples we had that we had ileostomy data on. So it all related back to the ileostomy data. So we went to 4 hours, and then we changed the levels of pancreatic alpha amylase and AMG to get those values that match with the ileostomy in a 4-hour incubation. And in doing that, what we did is we believe we get a much more accurate value for phosphate cross-linked starches, RS4s. A resistant maltodextrin was produced in the 2009 method. That's not produced, so that's great. And because of the shorter incubation time, you don't have to add sodium azide into the buffer, and nobody likes sodium azide. So you had to for 16 hours because the conditions were perfect for bugs to grow. And with the HPLC, we went to gel permeation away from sugar's water pack because one fraction of the fructans, the trisaccharide, chromatographed on water's sugar pack column as a disaccharide, so it was lost. And a lot of the commercial fructooligosaccharides, that can represent 15% of the product. So you can imagine the people making those products weren't too wrapped in that. That was something we didn't realize at the time, but so we made that change. And because we're using that column, we have to go to glycerol as the internal standard. And in certain cases, glycerol occurs in products. So we then recommend diethylene glycol as a standard. But we can't make diethylene glycol up stable at the concentration we need and supply it over years. It tends to crystallize, so we recommend that if people want to use it, they have to make it themselves. Okay, so looking at the methods, and you don't need to look at all that, but the difference between 2009.01 on the left-hand side and the rin-tin-tin method, as we call it, the RA and TDF method, on the right-hand side is that it's gone back to a 4-hour incubation, and we've increased the pancreatic alpha amylase from 2 to 4 units and the amyloglucosidase from 0.14 up to 1.7 units to get the reaction finished. Otherwise, it's all the same, down to the point where we actually do the HPLC, because we then use gel permeation, the TOSOSH TSK columns. We've also improved the sample handling, so we remove most of the salt in a tube with the resins, then we can inject straight onto the HPLC column with a cation-anion pre-column. And by removing most of the salts in a tube, you increase the use of that D-dashing column by about 20 times. So it actually makes it quite economically viable. Now, we are adding piles more of amyloglucosidase, so the enzyme has to be fairly pure. So if it has any contaminations, they're going to show up. So when you look at these traditional standards we use in the dietary fibre measurements, looking across, you see that the values are pretty much the same, except for the hyaline 7, which is RS2, high amylase maize starch. So we actually get higher values using saturating levels of the enzymes and running for 4 hours. And we have to believe that that value is more correct because this is a more physiologically relevant assay. When we go to the oligosaccharides, again, and polydextrose and things, again, things look pretty much the same, except for the fructooligosaccharides. We're picking up that extra 12 to 15% of the inulinotriose that we lost with 2009.01, and we're getting further hydrolysis of Advantafiber and isomorph oligosaccharides. I'll talk about that a little bit more later. Then we look at a whole range of samples, different sorts of things, and we again see the differences with hyaline 7. We come from 49 up to about 58, so from about 50 to 60%. With Fibersim, phosphate cross-linked, we're coming from about 30% up to 60% for that particular sample we analysed, and we believe that that value is correct. That method was published in 2015, so you can see it. We then ran an inter-laboratory evaluation through AACC and ICC. We had 13 laboratories involved from around the world, us being one of them. 104 sets of data, and 4 sets of data showed up as outliers, the ones that are shown on the thing. You know, you're not going to read that, it's just they're different colours you can see. Ran through the standard statistics. The sample details are there, so they're different sorts of cookies or starches or beans or whatever else. But the key thing is that when you look at the stats with the rapid integrated procedure, the reproducibility and the repeatability across the range of samples is better than any of the other methods previously published. Now, I'm not saying massively better, but it is better, so it's not worse. That's good. So the people that were involved in the study, we had Medallion Labs, Agriculture Canada, us, Food Grain Growers Australia, Sanitarium in Australia, Sudzucker in Belgium, the Food Safety Authority in Finland, 2 Japanese company, an Italian company, Eurofins in Europe, and Kellogg's company, and also Nestec in Switzerland. So we had a good run of the different types of industrial companies and analytical laboratories. When we put this forward, there was one complaint, and the complaint was that we were not getting the correct values for isomorph oligosaccharides, and we were still getting too low a value for RS4. And I'd just like to talk a little bit about those. Isomorph oligosaccharides, we're getting 10.3% with the rapid integrated procedure. If you run the Leo-Leprosky method, you actually get about 8%. And there's a paper published in 2000, and I think there's a year that I can't see it. 2014. Japanese paper where they were looking at the hydrolysis of oligosaccharides using the enzymes from the small intestine pigs, and they found complete hydrolysis. So I think the value of 10% for isomorph oligosaccharides is probably generous, actually. Then we look at Fibersim, phosphate cross-linked starches. So we had 6 different samples, A, B, C, D, and F. So we ran F as the one we use as our reference all the time in-house. Now, if you run them by the Prosky method, you can see the 85, 86 sorts of values. When you run them by this method, you're getting 14 up to 60%. And I think there's something in the manufacture of those that varies. So they're lower. Now, the thing we have to think about is how is the Prosky method run? And it says to run the assay at 98 to 100 or 96 to 100 degrees centigrade. I think it's 98 to 100 degrees centigrade. So we ran the Prosky method at those conditions and then different temperatures. So we did exactly the same thing but at different temperatures. Running at 100 degrees centigrade, you can see fibrocin we're getting on that one there, the red box up at the right-hand side, around about 75%. But if we go back just 5 degrees, it drops from that back to about 40% or 45%. So it's very, very method dependent on what you actually get. And I think that, and the other thing I should point out is down the bottom there, that in the boxes, I've got the activity of the thermostable amylase left after that incubation. So if you do 100 degrees for 30 minutes, less than 5% of the enzyme's left. So if there's not much enzyme, it's not going to be able to do much. So that's probably the reason why the values are so high. But the right-hand side is just showing the stability of the thermostable amylase at the different temperatures. On the left-hand side, we can see the stability of the enzymes used in the new method, the rapid procedure. Amyloglucosidase is perfectly stable. Pancreatic alpha amylase drops about half over the period of the incubation, but we add twice as much to the assay as we need. So it's twice saturating in the assay, so it's not going to be undersaturating. And the last point, I hope I'm not pushing my time too much, the last point I'd like to raise is that a number of people say, well, you can't use amyloglucosidase, we don't have amyloglucosidase in our small intestine. Well, we actually do. We have an enzyme called glucoamylase, which is one of the activities bound on the small intestine mucosa. But we don't have fungal amyloglucosidase. Why is it added? And the reason it's added is maltose inhibits pancreatic alpha amylase. So as stuff goes through our digestive system, the maltose is broken down by the enzymes in the small intestine and absorbed. In a bottle, that doesn't happen. So we have to get rid of the maltose by hydrolyzing, and we do that with amyloglucosidase. But then the argument is, well, amyloglucosidase also acts on starch. So how do you account for the fact you might be getting over-hydrolysis because of the AMG? And the best way I could see to do this, at least in an experiment, was to use another enzyme that has no action on starch. So the enzyme we chose was a pure Bacillus stereothermophilus alpha-glucosidase. And the main thing to see from this table is on the top part, outside the red box, you've got the standard 1,4 linked oligosaccharides. The enzyme's very stable and very active on maltose and all the other sorts of ones. As soon as you have a 1,6 linkage, the enzyme has no action and it has essentially no action on starch. So in this incubation, you can be sure that all it can do is hydrolyze the maltose and maltosaccharides. It can't touch the starch. So when we did the incubation, if we did the standard, this is a time course, standard incubation with the pancreatic alpha amylase and the AMG on fibrocin, you can see the curve going up, the black one. If we used no enzyme at all, you can see how the PAA alone, you can see how the maltose inhibits the hydrolysis by inhibiting the enzyme. But if we have the thermostable alpha-glucosidase, we're getting mighty close to what we get with the AMG. So in other words, the major action of the enzyme is removing the maltose. And in conclusion, the rapid integrated dietary fibre method, I believe, measures all of the non-digestible carbohydrates or dietary fibre, depending on which part of the world you come from, that are currently available today. Thank you.